Good evening. I'm going to be reading from a section that David wrote to me and asked me to read. By 1967, women started to demand to be heard. The modern women's movement, the second wave of feminism, in many ways sprang out of the early civil rights movement. I want to say, too, I had to edit this for Lent, so please read it yourself. Once racism was exposed and the lie of equal rights cracked open, other people, including women, began to articulate how they were oppressed and their need to fight, especially after the position of women in SNCC was raised as an explicit issue in November 1964, and the concept of women's liberation began percolating into SDS in the spring of 1967. Now, in case you did not know, the position of women in SNCC refers to a statement that Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, made when he was asked, what is the position of women in SNCC? SNCC is, of course, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was one of my, I was a fan of the organization as I was a fan of SDS, not a member of either, because I was in college and in the wrong place, the wrong part of the country, etc. But in any event, SNCC, of course, was operating in the South primarily. And as I said, when Stokely Carmichael was asked about the position of women in SNCC, he said the position of women in SNCC is to be prone. He actually meant supine. But the basic message was black women get back and be submissive. Did not work for me. Soon after, independent radical feminist organizations formed, such as WITCH, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. Naomi was a member, and a little later, Red Stockings. But what should have been a natural birth within SDS proved to be very traumatic. SDS's first Women's Liberation Caucus was held in June 1967 at the SDS National Convention, or NC, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Naomi and I went to this NC together, and she was clearly excited by what was happening in the workshop. Even those of us not attending the sessions could feel the electricity in the mix as we walked by the circle of women sitting on the lawn. As with all workshops, their chair presented a report to the plenary, but when Marilyn Buck took the stage to do so, all hell broke loose. Men hooted and whistled from the floor, threw paper planes at Marilyn, and shouted such gems as, quote, "I'll liberate you with my cock," end quote. Rush Limbaugh was not there. So it was more than upsetting. SDS was supposed to always side with the oppressed. Even with a new issue, it was hard to understand why SDS men wouldn't sympathize or at least listen. The circus response revealed the depth of sexism within SDS. Marilyn was amazing in the dignified and determined way she chaired that session. She never lowered herself to respond in kind to the catcalls and insults hurled at her, but neither did she retreat an inch in the face of the attack. While there was vociferous opposition, many other people spoke in favor of the proposal, mainly women, but also a couple of men. I had my hand raised but didn't get called on. The report was completed and accepted. Women's liberation had breached the sexist ramparts of the New Left. Both politics and practices about sexism were now on the agenda and went on to play a rarely noted role in the dramatic split of SDS that destroyed the organization in 1969. The fault line was primarily between Progressive Labor Party's effort with their claim that all nationalism is reactionary to get SDS to make a U-turn away from solidarity with Vietnam and the Panthers, and those of us, including Weather, who upheld the revolutionary youth movement strategy with solidarity with national liberation as a cutting edge. The June 1969 SDS National Convention was the most intense factional battle imaginable, where the very meaning and life of the premier radical organization among whites was at stake. Progressive labor had the strength of packing the meeting. We had the prestige coming from an alliance with the still widely revered Black Panthers. We looked forward to their address to the convention as a point that would turn the tide. The Panthers' spokesman started out great, but when he was asked about women's liberation, he dismissed it as pussy power. Pandemonium broke out on the floor as progressive labor seized the opportunity and started to scream, "Smash male chauvinism." It's not surprising that the Black Panther Party, like all left organizations of the day, was still rife with sexism. But the struggles against that were being led by women of color and could not and would not be imposed by groups of the white left, which themselves were sexist. Delegates immediately lined up at the mic for a chance to speak. Like virtually everyone else, I was responding to the situation in terms of the all-consuming faction fight. That is not around the sexism, but around the two warring political ideologies. When I saw Naomi Jaffe approach the mic, I said to myself with a sigh of relief, great, one of our people will get to speak and put progressive labor in its place. To my surprise, Naomi's voice rang out across the tumultuous hall with, quote, "We will not allow women's liberation to be used as a political football," end quote. What a dramatic moment and powerful lesson. Women's oppression in politics were too important to be reduced to a weapon in a faction fight, even a historic one by our side. It was only with later discussion that I understood the second aspect, her refusal to excuse our side's shortcomings on women. Our line about male supremacy notwithstanding, our practice in politics were atrocious in many ways. While many of us supported caucuses within the left, we tended to have contempt for those who formed an independent women's movement. And men were using free love as a tool to make women sexually available rather than as an opening to let love and equality flourish. Our political program about women's issues was reduced to extolling women guerrillas in the third world and urging women here to become fighters. Doing so was an important role and contribution of women, but limiting our focus to armed struggle was not only a negation of the many other crucial battles against patriarchy, but also tended to promote a macho concept of struggle in which the humanistic basis for our militancy got lost. Only later did I learn from Naomi and others what a difficult, almost schizophrenic period it was for them. Politically at home, neither in the anti-imperialist left, which with its still rampant sexism, or the predominantly white women's movement, which distanced itself from frontline national liberation struggles and gravitated toward defining women's issues from a white and often middle-class perspective. Some individuals, like the outspoken Black feminist Florence Kennedy, and a few scattered organizing efforts worked in both arenas, but in most ways, the two broad movements were on separate, often divergent tracks. So a couple of comments. When it talks about how the only value that they saw or what they were encouraging women to do was to become freedom fighters involved in armed struggle, what I wrote in my margin was that women were already battling and fighting life and death struggles because of violence against women. All women are fighters. We have to be. One out of 4 women in this country will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. I don't have the statistic for domestic violence and for physical assault, but the numbers are staggering. So it's really so ridiculous to me to view women as only valuable if they take up a weapon and fight in some organized military action, as opposed to just trying to get home from work in one piece. I lived in Boston in the 1970s. In 1979, there were 11 or 12 Black women murdered in Boston in a 4-month period. So was that a war zone or not? We did a lot of very important organizing around that. I want to bring to your attention the section that I read and that David asked me to read. I want to bring to your attention the comment, in this atmosphere, this is not my question though, Naomi, but you can write it down if you wish. In this atmosphere of Black male sexism and white left and feminist racism, can you imagine the huge difficulty for black and other women of color on the left? Interestingly enough, when I met Naomi, when I moved to Albany in the mid-1980s, we discovered eventually that we had been at the New School for Social Research at the same time. I spent my junior year of college at the New School of Social Research when Naomi and David were there as graduate students. If you've ever been down there, I know they have more buildings now, but at that time there were 2 buildings. They were, of course, vertical buildings because it was New York City, and the way you got from classroom to classroom was to ride the elevator. So I said, undoubtedly, we were all on the elevators together at different times, and we didn't know each other. Quite amazing. But I was already involved with the left. I was already involved with protesting the war in Vietnam, which I was told was a white issue, although most of the people who died there were people of color on both sides. The people who lived there in Vietnam, and the predominantly black and poor and brown and poor soldiers who could not avoid the draft because they were not in college. But in any event, as I said, I was already involved with issues, and certainly with the civil rights movement too. There was no place for me to be involved in SDS at the New School because I was a black woman. I remember having conversations with my very radical and very smart classmates who were white males, and I could see their eyes glaze over as I would engage with them in conversations because it was like, how does she know this stuff? And why is she saying this stuff? She's a black chick. So, as I said, there was no place for me there. I was there in the school year 67, 68, so I was there when Columbia went out on strike. The New School was so cool that we closed down in solidarity. And a lot of people who were at the New School went up to Columbia. I did not, because again, there's really no place for a person like me. So here's my question, Naomi. Why do women continue to be so devalued on the right, on the left, and in the middle? Because with what we've seen in the last few days, in the last few weeks, it just goes on and on. So that's my question. And thank you.
I just want to say that in the paragraph after the passage that Barbara just read, what David says is that the beginnings of the coming together of those movements happened only with the leadership of women of color, with the emergence of the leadership of women of color and the recognition of the importance of women of color, feminists of color, in defining the intersections of race, sex, and class. And that when that leadership began to be recognized by some portions of the left, it began to define the ways that those intersections happened, and that Barbara, as David says in this passage, was absolutely central to the emergence of that intersectionality. Thank you, Barbara.